In the year 2387, when humanity had clawed its way across 17 star systems with nothing but stubborn defiance and an inexplicable refusal to die quietly, the galaxy learned what it meant to underestimate a species born from a world that actively tried to kill them daily. The trading station Nexus Tertius hung in the void like a metallic tumor, its corridors pulsing with the nervous energy of 1,000 species who had gathered here not out of friendship but out of necessity. Credits flowed like blood through its veins, and in the darker sections where the lighting dimmed and the air recyclers wheezed with age, desperate souls made desperate bargains. Captain Jake Harrison had seen worse places than this. Hell, he'd created worse places than this. Standing 6'4" with shoulders that had been broadened by years of hauling cargo in variable gravity, Jake possessed the particular brand of weathered handsomeness that came from surviving things that should have killed him. His gray eyes held the kind of patience that was less virtue and more weapon. The patience of a predator who knew that everything eventually came within reach. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline wasn't from combat. It was from the time he'd held a breached airlock shut with his bare hands for 43 minutes while his crew evacuated. The doctors said it was impossible. Jake had shrugged and asked for coffee. That was the thing about humans. The galaxy had learned. They didn't particularly care what was impossible. Another successful negotiation, Jake muttered, pocketing the credit chip that would keep his ship, the Defiant Heart, running for another few months. The Relkan merchant he'd been dealing with had tried to cheat him twice during the conversation. Jake had simply smiled, that particular smile that made smart beings very nervous, and suggested they recalculate. They had, quickly. Now walking through the station's mid-tier market district, Jake's attention was caught by something that made his jaw clench. A crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an auction block, and the merchandise being displayed wasn't cargo. It was people, or beings that were close enough to people to make Jake's blood pressure spike. The auctioneer was a Vaxian, one of those tall insectoid creatures, whose species had perfected bureaucracy into an art form. Its mandibles clicked rhythmically as it gestured with 4 spindly arms toward the current lot. A group of small humanoid creatures who stood no taller than Jake's waist. They were Krithak, he realized. A species from the Outer Rim whose homeworld had been strip-mined into sterility 3 years ago. Refugees scattered across the galaxy, with no government to protect them, and no military to fear. Perfect victims. Lot 17. The Vaxian auctioneer buzzed, its voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. 5 healthy Krithak, suitable for domestic service, light manufacturing or entertainment. Bidding starts at 50 credits per unit. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Around him, various aliens called out bids with the casual indifference of beings purchasing tools. The Krithak, 3 males and 2 females, if Jake was reading their features correctly, stood with the defeated posture of people who had given up hope so thoroughly they'd forgotten what it looked like. All except one. She was the smallest of the group, barely reaching 3 feet in height, with the delicate bone structure that marked her as young even by Krithak standards. Her skin held the pale blue-silver coloration of her species, and her large, dark eyes swept the crowd with an alertness that spoke of intelligence barely restrained by despair. When those eyes met Jake's, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or simply the acknowledgement of one survivor seeing another. The bidding reached 200 credits per unit. Going once. Going twice. 5,000. For all of them. The words left Jake's mouth before his brain had fully processed the decision. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, and the sudden silence felt like a held breath. The Vaxian auctioneer's compound eyes focused on Jake with mechanical precision. 5,000 credits for the entire lot? That seems excessive, human. Jake stepped forward, and the crowd parted. There was something about the way humans moved, like they were always half a second away from violence, that made other species uncomfortable. Jake had never tried to correct this impression. "My ship needs crew," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent market. "Good crew is worth paying for." "Crew?" The auctioneer's mandibles twitched in what might have been amusement. "These are domestics, human. They lack the proper neural conditioning for technical work. Then I guess I'll have to train them." The credit transfer took less than a minute. The legal ownership papers took even less time. Apparently, when you purchased people, the paperwork was depressingly efficient. 5 minutes later, Jake found himself walking toward his ship with 5 bewildered Kritheg following at what they apparently considered a safe distance. The smallest one, the female who'd met his eyes, stayed closest, though still far enough away to run if necessary. The Defiant Heart was not an impressive vessel by galactic standards. She was a modified freight hauler, built for endurance rather than speed or beauty. Her hull was scarred by micrometeorite impacts and painted in the particular shade of gray that came from countless emergency repairs. But she was home and she was freedom, and right now she represented safety for 5 beings who had forgotten what that word meant. Jake's crew met them at the airlock. First Officer Rivers, a compact woman whose tactical intelligence had been sharpened by 3 tours in the Centauri conflict. Chief Engineer Park, whose cybernetic left arm interfaced directly with the ship's systems and who could make broken things work through sheer stubborn expertise. And Dr. Amanda Cross, whose medical skills had been learned in field hospitals where the choice was often between saving a life and saving 3. They took one look at Jake's new acquisitions and asked no questions. That was the thing about his crew, they trusted his judgment, even when it appeared to make no sense. Quarters 7 through 11 are empty, Rivers reported, her tone professional. I can have them set up within the hour. Food? Jake asked. Standard rations should be compatible with Krithak physiology. Dr. Cross replied, I'll need to run some basic medical checks. Make sure they're not carrying anything communicable. Park nodded toward the smallest Krithak, who had positioned herself behind Jake's left leg and was peering around it like it was a shield. That one seems attached to you already, Captain. Jake looked down. The young Krithak, he really needed to learn their names, was indeed standing so close that she was almost touching him. Her large eyes were fixed on his face with an intensity that was both gratifying and slightly unsettling. I'm Jake, he said, crouching down to her eye level. What's your name? She whispered something in her own language, so softly that even Jake's enhanced hearing couldn't catch it. Zeketh, one of the male Krithak translated, his accented English careful and precise. Her name is Zeketh. She has not spoken much since. He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had led them to this moment. Jake nodded. Well, Zeketh, welcome aboard the Defiant Heart. You're safe now. The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her large eyes went impossibly wide, and Jake realized she was crying, the barely audible sound of someone who had learned not to make noise when they wept. Then, without warning, she launched herself forward and wrapped her tiny arms around Jake's neck. He caught her instinctively, supporting her weight as she clung to him with a desperation that spoke of someone who had been drowning and had suddenly found solid ground. Hey, he said softly, his voice gentle in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd seen him in combat. It's okay, you're okay now. Over her head he met the eyes of his crew. They understood. They'd all been refugees once, in their own way. They'd all known what it felt like to be alone in a universe that didn't care if you lived or died. But that was the thing about humans, they specialized in caring when no one else would. 3 hours later, after the medical checks and temporary quarters had been arranged, Jake found himself in his private cabin staring at a problem he hadn't anticipated. Zeketh was sitting in the corner of his room, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching him with those impossibly large eyes. You know you have your own quarters, right? He said gently. Number 9. It's got a bed, a food dispenser, everything you need. She whispered something in Krithak. She says she doesn't want to be alone. Dr. Cross translated from the doorway. The ship's doctor was carrying a steaming mug of something that smelled like chocolate and concern. I've been talking with the others. Their homeworld was bad, Jake. Really bad. The mining operations didn't just destroy the environment, they broke up families, separated communities. She's probably the sole survivor from her clan group. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. How old is she? By human standards, maybe 16, 17. For her species, she's barely an adult. Old enough to survive on her own. Young enough to imprint on the first source of safety she's found. As if to emphasize the point, Zeketh slid off the chair and padded over to Jake on bare feet. She stopped just out of arm's reach and extended one small, delicate hand toward him. Her fingers were trembling. Jake took her hand gently. Her skin was warm and impossibly soft, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse. "Kathai shori nakare," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes that held far too much hope. Dr. Cross sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh, what?" Jake asked, though something in his chest was already tightening. That's old Krethak. Formal language. She just called you protector who guards against the darkness. It's not just gratitude, Jake. It's a life bond. In her culture, when someone saves you from certain death, you owe them everything until you can return the favor. Jake stared down at the tiny alien who was now pressing herself against his side like she could merge with his shadow. And if she can never return the favor, then she belongs to you. Completely. Until death. The words hung in the air like a curse. Or maybe a blessing. Jake wasn't sure which. Outside his cabin, alarms began to sound, not the sharp, urgent blast of immediate danger, but the lower, more ominous tone that meant something was approaching the station. Something that shouldn't be. River's voice crackled over the comm system. "Captain to the bridge. We've got company. Hegemony warships, 3 of them, and they're broadcasting a search warrant." Jake felt Seketh's grip on his hand tighten until her small fingernails drew blood. When he looked down at her, her face had gone pale enough that he could see the delicate tracery of veins beneath her skin. "They've found us," she whispered in perfectly clear English. "They've come to take us back." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Outside, the station's defensive systems were powering up, the deep thrumming of energy weapons charging for battle. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer by the second, Jake could hear the distinctive whine of hegemony patrol craft. He'd thought he was saving refugees from slavery. He was beginning to realize he might have just started a war. The bridge of the Defiant Heart had seen better days, but it had also seen far worse ones. Right now, as Jake settled into the captain's chair with Zucketh practically welded to his side, it felt like a fortress under siege. On the main screen, 3 hegemony cruisers hung in space like mechanical predators, their weapon ports glowing with barely restrained violence. They were Dominator-class vessels, designed not for exploration or trade, but for the specific purpose of making entire star systems surrender without firing a shot. "Status report," Jake ordered, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd faced impossible odds before. Rivers didn't look up from her tactical display. "They're broadcasting on all frequencies. Something about stolen property and harboring criminals. The station administrator is trying to negotiate, but the hegemony isn't interested in talking. What about our exit strategy?" Chief Engineer Park's cybernetic interface flickered with data streams. "Jump drive is operational, but it'll take 40 minutes to charge. The station's mass shadow is interfering with our quick start protocols." 40 minutes. Jake had been in firefights that lasted longer, but right now it felt like an eternity. Zeketh made a small sound. Not quite a whimper, more like the noise a wounded animal might make when it knows the predator has found its hiding place. Her small fingers dug into Jake's arm with desperate strength. "Captain," Dr. Cross's voice came through the comm from the medical bay, tight with controlled anger. "I've been talking with our other passengers. The hegemony didn't just buy them at auction. They're the ones who supplied them to the auction house in the first place." The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind like the chambers of a revolver being loaded. This whole thing was a setup. "Not a setup," Rivers corrected grimly. "A trap. They wanted to see who would be stupid enough to interfere with their operation." Jake felt a smile spread across his face, not the pleasant expression he used for negotiations, but the predatory grin that had earned him a reputation in 12-star systems. "Well, they found someone." The comm system crackled to life with an incoming transmission. The voice that emerged was artificially modulated, stripped of emotion and personality. "Vessel Defiant Heart, you are in violation of Hegemony Commercial Code 847B, interference with lawful property transfer. You will immediately surrender the stolen merchandise and submit to inspection." Jake reached for the communications controls, but Zeketh's hand shot out to stop him. She was staring at the speaker with the expression of someone seeing a ghost. "That voice," she whispered. her English now flawless despite the terror that made her whole body shake. "I know that voice." "You have 30 seconds to comply," the transmission continued. "Failure to do so will result in the confiscation of your vessel and the immediate termination of all biological assets aboard." Biological assets. They weren't even pretending these were people. Jake keyed the comm. "This is Captain Jake Harrison of the Defiant Heart. I purchased these individuals through legal channels. I have the documentation to prove it." A pause. Then, "Captain Harrison. Yes, we have a file on you, human, former military. Psychological profile indicates abnormal protective instincts and a pattern of interfering in situations beyond your jurisdiction." "That's one way to put it," Jake muttered. "The merchandise you purchased was not legally available for sale. They are escaped prisoners from a hegemony correctional facility. By harboring them, you have made yourself complicit in their crimes." Zikith was shaking now, violent tremors that made her teeth chatter. "Lies," she said, but so quietly that only Jake could hear her. "All lies." Jake's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "What crimes?" he asked the comm. "Species preservation violations. Refusal to accept genetic modification protocols. Resistance to cultural integration mandates." The voice paused, and when it resumed, Jake could swear he heard amusement creeping in. "In simpler terms, Captain, they refused to become what we needed them to become." The blood in Jake's veins turned to ice water. Genetic modification, cultural integration. He'd heard those terms before in intelligence briefings from the Outer Rim. The hegemony didn't just conquer species, they optimized them. "They're trying to change us," Zigeth said, her voice barely audible. "Make us better servants. Stronger bodies, smaller minds, no memory of home." She looked up at Jake with eyes that held a pain too deep for someone so young. "The ones who resist, they disappear." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, not anger, which he'd expected, but something colder and more dangerous. The same feeling he'd had when he'd held that airlock shut while his crew escaped. The feeling of a man discovering exactly how far he was willing to go. "You have 15 seconds, Captain Harrison." Jake stood up, gently lifting Zikith and setting her in the chair beside his. She immediately curled up into a ball, making herself as small as possible. "Rivers?" he said quietly. "Tactical options." His first officer didn't hesitate. "None that end with us alive." "Those are heavy cruisers, Jake. We're a freight hauler with delusions of adequacy." "Park." "Engines are operating at optimal efficiency. If we run, we might make it to the jump point." "And leave the station to face hegemony retaliation?" Park's silence was answer enough. "Time's up, Captain." Jake keyed the comm one more time. "Tell you what," he said, his voice carrying the particular blend of casual confidence and barely restrained violence that had made him famous. "Why don't you come over here and take them?" The silence that followed stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "Captain Harrison, you appear to be under the mistaken impression that you have some sort of choice in this matter." "I am making a choice," Jake replied. "I'm choosing not to hand over 5 innocent people to slavers who want to lobotomize them for convenience. Even if it means the destruction of your vessel and the death of your crew." Jake looked around the bridge, at Rivers, whose tactical mind was already calculating firing solutions for weapons they didn't have. At Park, whose cybernetic interface was probably running every possible escape scenario simultaneously. At Dr. Cross, who had quietly appeared in the doorway with a medical kit that Jake suspected contained more than just bandages. "Even then," Jake said. The comm went silent. On the tactical display, the hegemony cruisers began moving into attack formation. "Captain," Rivers said quietly, "I'm reading energy spikes from their weapon systems. They're not bluffing." Jake was about to respond when Zigith suddenly uncurled from her chair. She moved with the fluid grace of her species, stepping close enough to Jake that he could feel the warmth radiating from her small body. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "About why they want us back so badly. Zikith, we're not just refugees," she continued, her words coming faster now. "My people, we were explorers before the hegemony came. We found things in the deep void. Old things. Dangerous things. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. What kind of thing? She reached into a fold in her clothing and pulled out something that made everyone on the bridge take a step backward. It was a small, crystalline object that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Just looking at it made Jake's eyes water. Locations, she whispered. Coordinates to places the galaxy forgot. Weapons from wars fought before your species learned to make fire. Technologies that could reshape reality itself. The crystal in her hand pulsed once, and for a moment Jake could swear he saw something vast and terrible moving in its depths. The hegemony thinks they wiped out the knowledge when they destroyed our homeworld, Zeketh said. But 5 of us escaped. 5 of us still remember where the ancient places are hidden. Jake stared at the crystal, understanding flooding through him like cold water. That's why the auction. That's why the trap. They need you alive. They need our memories intact, Zeketh confirmed. But if they can't have us willingly. She looked up at Jake with eyes that held a terrible determination. I would rather die than let them have what we know. The tactical display suddenly erupted with warnings. The hegemony cruisers were moving, abandoning their formation in favor of a direct approach. They weren't planning to negotiate anymore. Jake, Rivers said urgently. We need to move, now. But Jake was staring at Zeketh, at the crystal in her hands, at the future that was suddenly reshaping itself around them. He thought about the choice he'd made in the market, the simple decision to help someone who needed help. He thought about the consequences that were bearing down on them like an avalanche. And he thought about the fact that somewhere in the galaxy, there were ancient weapons that could level the playing field. Park, he said quietly. How fast can you get us to hyperspace? 38 minutes, if we push. No. Jake's voice carried a finality that made everyone turn to look at him. How fast can you get us to hyperspace if you don't care about the ship surviving the transition? Park's cybernetic interface went dark for a moment. When it flickered back to life, his expression was grim. 12 minutes. Maybe 15 if we're lucky. Do it. Jake, Dr. Cross said from the doorway. That's suicide. Jake looked at Zeketh, who was still clutching the crystal like it contained the last hope in the universe. Maybe it did. No, he said softly. That's evolution. The ship's engines began to whine as Park pushed them beyond their design specifications. Outside, the hegemony cruisers opened fire, their weapons lighting up the void like artificial stars. And in the depths of space, something ancient and patient felt the first stirrings of awakening. The jump to hyperspace felt like dying and being reborn in the span of a heartbeat. The defiant heart shuddered through dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend, her hull groaning under stresses that should have torn her apart. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Park had interfaced so deeply with the ship's systems that the boundary between man and machine had become academic. On the bridge, Jake held Zeketh as she convulsed through what Dr. Cross had grimly diagnosed as temporal displacement syndrome, a condition that occurred when organic minds experienced hyperspace transitions. They weren't properly shielded for. Where are we going? Rivers asked, her voice tight with the strain of keeping the ship together through sheer force of will. Jake looked down at Zeketh, who was mumbling coordinates in a language that predated human civilization by millennia. Wherever she's taking us. The crystal in Zeketh's hands had begun to glow, not with reflected light, but with something that seemed to emanate from the very structure of space around it. Through the swirling chaos of hyperspace, Jake could see patterns emerging. Path roads through the void that led to places that didn't appear on any star chart. Captain, Dr. Cross reported from her makeshift medical station. The other Krithak are responding to whatever that thing is doing. Their brain activity is off the charts. It's like they're remembering things. Jake understood. The crystal wasn't just a storage device, it was a key, and they were approaching the lock it was designed to open. The transition back to normal space came without warning. One moment they were tumbling through hyperspace, the next they were floating in a system that shouldn't exist. 3 dead stars hung in perfect triangular formation, their dark surfaces rippling with energy that Jake's instruments couldn't identify. Between them, like a spider at the center of an impossible web, floated a structure that made Jake's mind rebel against what he was seeing. It was vast, easily the size of a small moon, but it seemed to fold in on itself in ways that hurt to contemplate. Its surfaces shifted between states of matter that had no names, and looking at it too long made Jake feel like he was forgetting how to breathe. Keth Farnultaran, Zikath, whispered, her voice filled with a awe that bordered on terror. The nexus of the first builders. The what now? Rivers asked, but her tactical displays were already screaming warnings about energy signatures that defied classification. Zikath stood on unsteady legs, the crystal in her hands now pulsing in rhythm with something deep within the alien structure. Before your species, before mine, before most life in this galaxy. They built this place as a repository, a library, a weapon. Jake felt something cold crawl up his spine. A weapon for what? For the next time the galaxy needed to choose between freedom and extinction. Before Jake could ask what that meant, the ship's proximity alarms began shrieking. On the tactical display, hyperspace portals were opening. Dozens of them, disgorging hegemony warships like drops of poison spreading through water. How the hell did they follow us? Rivers demanded. The answer came from the smallest of the male Krithak, who had remained silent during the entire journey. Now he stepped forward, his face a mask of resignation and regret. Because I told them where we were going, he said in perfect, unaccented English. The silence on the bridge was broken only by the sound of weapon systems powering up all around them. Jake turned to look at the Krithak Veltar. He remembered now, and saw guilt and determination warring in his large eyes. They have my clutch sister, Veltar said quietly. 47 children from my family group. They promised they would live if I led them here. Jake felt Zikath sag against him, the betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. You don't understand, she whispered. The location of this place was supposed to die with us. It was the one secret we swore to keep. I kept it for 3 years, Veltar replied, tears streaming down his face. 3 years of watching my people disappear. 3 years of hearing their screams in my dreams. I couldn't hold out any longer. The hegemony fleet was massive. At least 30 ships ranging from frigates to something that Jake's sensors identified as a dreadnought. They formed a perfect sphere around the ancient station, cutting off any possibility of escape. Captain Harrison, the familiar voice came over the comm, you have exceeded our expectations. Not only have you delivered our escaped property, but you have also led us to the greatest archaeological find in galactic history. Jake keyed the comm. In what exactly do you think you're going to find here? The same thing your small friend carries. Knowledge. Technology. Power sufficient to reshape the galaxy according to our design. A pause. We are prepared to be generous, Captain. Surrender now and your crew will be granted quick deaths. Continue to resist, and we will make the process educational. Jake looked around the bridge. His crew was looking back at him with expressions of grim determination. They'd followed him this far. They'd follow him into hell if necessary. You know what? Jake said into the comm. I think I'll stick with option 3. There is no option 3, Captain Harrison. Jake smiled, and this time it was the expression that had made him legendary in 17 star systems. There's always an option 3, he nodded to Zikath, who was now glowing with the same eerie light as the crystal in her hands. Do it? She pressed the crystal against the ship's communications array and Jake felt reality hiccup. The ancient station responded like a flower opening to sunlight. Massive apertures that had been sealed for millions of years began to iris open, revealing chambers that stretched beyond the horizon. Energy cascaded through the structure in patterns that made Jake's enhanced vision blur and refocus. And from the depths of the station, something vast and patient and utterly alien began to wake up. The first hegemony ship to approach the station simply stopped existing. Not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased from reality so completely that Jake's instruments couldn't even register that it had ever been there. All units, withdraw to safe distance, came the panic transmission from the hegemony fleet commander. Repeat, withdraw. The transmission cut off as the commander's ship followed the first into non-existence. What is that thing? Rivers whispered, her tactical displays struggling to process what they were seeing. Zikath's voice, when she answered, didn't sound quite like her anymore. It carried harmonics that spoke of vast age and terrible purpose. It is the curator, The last guardian of the first builders. It has been waiting for someone worthy to claim the inheritance. Jake felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What inheritance? The tools to reshape the galaxy. The voice that wasn't quite Sicket's replied. The weapons to destroy oppression at its source. The power to make the universe free. Around them, the hegemony fleet was retreating in controlled panic. But Jake could see more hyperspace signatures appearing at the edge of the system. They were calling for reinforcements. How long until they come back with enough firepower to crack this place open? He asked. Time is not the constraint, Sicketh replied. Worthiness is. The station pulsed once, and Jake felt something vast and alien touch his mind. Not invasively, but questioningly. It was reading him, evaluating him, determining whether he deserved the power that was being offered. It saw his memories, the airlock he'd held shut with bleeding hands, the crew he'd saved at the cost of his own ship, the strangers he'd helped because helping them was the right thing to do. It saw his failures too, the battles he'd lost, the people he couldn't save, the choices that had led to pain and death. But most of all, it saw his stubbornness, his absolute irrational refusal to let evil win while he still had breath in his body. The presence withdrew, and Jake could swear he felt approval. The inheritance is yours, Guardian, Sicketh said, but now her voice was her own again. But the price? Jake already knew what the price would be. He could feel it in the way the station was calling to him, in the way the crystal in Sicketh's hands was dissolving into motes of light that flowed toward him like living stars. I have to stay, he said quietly. Don't I? Sicketh nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. The station needs a caretaker, someone to decide who deserves access to the ancient weapons. Someone to stand guard against those who would use this power for conquest rather than liberation. Jake felt the weight of eternity settling on his shoulders. Around him, his crew was watching with expressions of understanding and loss. How long? Rivers asked. Until the galaxy no longer needs a guardian, Sicketh replied. Or until someone more worthy claims the responsibility. Jake nodded slowly. It wasn't the ending he'd planned, but it was the ending that made sense. He looked at each of his crew members in turn. The family he'd chosen and who had chosen him in return. Take the ship, he said quietly. Take the other Kritak and get them somewhere safe. Let the galaxy know that there are still places where freedom matters more than profit. Jake, Dr. Cross started to protest. That's an order, he said firmly. Then more gently. It's not goodbye. It's just a longer goodbye than usual. Sicketh stepped close to him, her small hand finding his. I'm staying too. You don't have to. Kathai Shuri Nakari, she said firmly. I called you protector, who guards against the darkness. But darkness guards against darkness too. You'll need someone to remind you what you're protecting. Jake felt something inside his chest that might have been his heart breaking. Or maybe it was his heart finally learning what it was for. The ancient station pulsed again, and Jake felt power flow into him. Not the crude energy of weapons or engines, but something deeper. The power to see across space and time, to know when freedom was threatened, to respond with the accumulated arsenal of the galaxy's first civilization. His crew said their goodbyes with the quiet dignity of professionals who had always known this job might kill them. Rivers saluted. Burke promised to keep the defiant heart flying until the stars went dark. Dr. Cross hugged him and whispered something about taking care of himself that made him laugh despite everything. Then they were gone, and Jake was alone in a station the size of a world with a tiny alien who had decided that his fate was worth sharing. 6 months later, when the hegemony returned with a fleet of 1,000 ships, they found the system empty except for a single transmission beacon broadcasting a message in 17 languages. This space is under the protection of the Guardian. Those who come in peace may pass. Those who come with conquest in their hearts will find only darkness between the stars. This is the only warning you will receive. The hegemony fleet, commander being a practical being, chose to investigate anyway. None of those ships were ever seen again. But across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds where the strong preyed on the weak, people began to tell stories of a human who had claimed the power of ancient gods and used it to make the universe a little more fair. They called him the Guardian. They said he watched from the darkness between stars, and that he would always come when freedom needed defending. Most of them were right. And in the depths of the ancient station, Jake Harrison sat in a chair older than human civilization, with a tiny alien curled up in his lap like a cat, watching the galaxy through sensors that could see across space and time. Zikith stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in her own language. Jake's translation implants, enhanced by ancient technology, told him she was dreaming of home. He smiled and stroked her silver hair, feeling the weight of responsibility and the warmth of companionship in equal measure. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, and somewhere in the void, another cry for help was echoing across space. Jake Harrison, guardian of the ancient arsenal, protector of the weak, and accidental father figure to a refugee who refused to leave his side, felt his enhanced senses focusing on the distant distress signal. "Looks like someone needs help," he murmured. Zikith's eyes opened, bright, intelligent, and filled with the particular kind of anticipation that came from knowing they were about to make the universe a better place. "Then we should help them," she said simply. The ancient station began to move, carrying them toward another war, another injustice, another chance to prove that sometimes the impossible was just another word for what hadn't been tried yet. In the end, Jake reflected, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.